Chapter 9, Behavior and Misconduct, Part 1. This chapter focuses on both police behavior and misbehavior. Misbehavior and misconduct are subsets of police behavior. So when we talk about police behavior initially in these first PowerPoint presentations, we're talking about behavior generally, and certainly some of these principles can also be used to explain police misbehavior. So let's start first with police behavior generally. Your book identifies a couple different perspectives for understanding police behavior. There are universalistic perspectives and particularistic perspectives. Universalistic perspectives focus on how police officers are similar. So we're looking for common traits, common explanations for police behaviors. Whereas particularistic will look at that individual officer and try to explain how is that officer different from another officer. So with universalistic perspectives, we are still going to identify differences, but we're looking for common traits, common motivators for police behavior, and common explanations for police behaviors. So if we break this down, universalistic perspectives, into more specific perspectives, we find that there are sociological perspectives. And so the sociological perspective looks more at the context, the environment in which police work is occurring. So it can include the environment in which police officers are hired, in which they're trained, and in which they interact with the citizens. And so all of these things can combine if we look at the context. What kind of atmosphere is policing occurring in? That's likely going to affect the behavior that police demonstrate. So are we in a low crime residential area versus maybe an urban high crime area where the police are not very popular and they're not supported, there's not much cooperation from the public, versus that residential area where it's low crime and the people view their police as as honest, as having integrity, as being professional, as being deserving of their respect. Well, the differences between those two neighborhoods are going to likely produce different police behaviors. What kind of, for the social context in which police officers are hired, what kind of, is this a context where it's highly competitive, or is it pretty much, if you have a heartbeat, you can get a job with this agency? So how demanding is it? What kind of reputation does it have? All these kinds of things. The psychological perspective looks at how does police work itself affect the police officer's psychological identity, the police officer's personality, their psyche. So if you're, again, in an environment that isn't very supportive, if you're always seeing the worst side of society, we've got to watch, because that may affect your personality, and you may become more and more and more cynical as your career progresses. Or are you in an environment where, even though it's a tough environment, nonetheless you feel like you're making a difference and you feel like you're supported? More likely you're going to maintain your optimism that you can change society, you can change the world. So psychological perspective, how does police work affect an officer's personality? The organizational perspective, you can probably guess pretty quickly. We look at how do departmental factors, such as the organization of the department. Is this a paramilitary type organization, or is this more of a service or community policing type organization? What's the workload? What's the culture of the department? Are they an honest department? Are they dishonest? Are they very professional? Do they have very high standards, or do they have very low standards? What's the nature of the workload? Are you constantly running from call to call to call? Do they do traditional policing? Do they do community policing? All of these kinds of things. Is it a more laid-back community? These can all affect how you actually behave as a police officer. The particularistic perspectives, again, focus on how police officers are different. And so we're really looking for not those similarities as we do for the universalistic. What are the things that are common to all police officers? At least some really general traits, but here we're looking at more why does one police officer in the same environment, in the same department, why is that police officer different than another police officer? And so often the particularistic perspective is the basis for the typologies, and there are tons of typologies out there. We took a look at Muir's typology. If you remember, it was the one that had passion and perspective as the main considerations, and we said that police officers are professionals, they're avoiders, they're enforcers, they're reciprocators based on whether they have perspective, whether they have passion. That's just one typology. There are tons, as I said. We're not going to be able to look at them all. In fact, I'm only going to present one here, which is in your textbook, and it's Warden's axes, not axis. We're not talking about chopping wood out in the woods, but the axes of ways that police officers differ. So Warden identified 5 different ways that police officers can differ. These, he felt, were important aspects of policing that could explain a lot of the differences between and among police officers. So what are they? Well, first of all, what is their worldview? How do they view human nature? Are they cynical? Are they optimistic? Do they view the cup as half empty or even worse? Do they view it as half full or even better? I mean, what is their view on human nature? Or do they view people as mostly good but flawed? Or do they view people as mostly terrible, and when they do something good for one another, it's only by accident, or it's the exception? So again, these are the extremes. Most people fall somewhere in between the purely optimistic and the purely cynical. But this can influence, obviously, how a police officer behaves. Are they really cynical? Are they really optimistic? Are they altruistic? Are they pessimistic? All these kinds of things. Role orientations can distinguish different police officers. So do I view myself, if I'm a police officer, do I view myself primarily as a crime fighter? Well, then I'm probably going to mostly do crime fighting type work. I'm going to go out there, I'm going to enforce the law, and that's my primary job. Or do I view my job mainly as being a service provider? I don't do much crime fighting, maybe because there isn't much crime in my neighborhood that I police. I do mostly service, and that's what I believe my role is. So that's mostly what I'm going to focus on. Or am I a peacekeeper? I'm mostly engaged in order maintenance. I'm trying to keep the peace. Don't let the disorder get too much out of hand. Keep it under relative control. So again, what role orientation? How do I perceive my job as a police officer? One officer could, in the same department, could perceive his or her job to be a crime fighter, and another officer might perceive it to be a peacekeeper. So again, that can explain differences within a single police department. What are the attitudes of the officer towards the rules that bind them, the legal and departmental restrictions? Do I view the Constitution as the defense of the Constitution as one of my primary functions? So I understand that, yeah, the Fourth Amendment may make my job harder because I just can't search at any time, any place, but I understand why it's there, and I value it. I will respect it. I will honor it. And I will not cut corners. Or do I take the opposite approach and say, it's a nuisance. If I need to get the job done, I'm going to do it regardless of the rules. And so again, what kind of perspective does the officer have? What kind of attitude does the officer have towards rules? Whether it's the law or departmental policies and rules. Whom do the police actually police? Who are their clientele? And so this obviously could be the citizens that they police. Who are they? Do the police respect them? Do the police recognize that they're human beings with rights and feelings and dreams and beliefs and all those other kinds of great things? Or do they view them as mostly the enemy? Not just the citizens, but also what about the other agencies that they work with? What about the courts? What about the social service agencies? What about the politicians, the mayor, the governor, the city council? What is their relationship with these other clientele as well? And so if they have a bad relationship, it's going to affect their behavior in one way. If they have a good relationship, it's going to affect their behavior in another way. What are their relationships with management and with their coworkers? So do they get along with management? Do they respect management? Do they think that their supervisors are mostly competent and honest and fair leaders? Or do they view them as the enemy? Similarly, how do they view their coworkers? So these kinds of relationships can affect how they actually do their job. Do they look forward to coming to work, or do they dread it? And that's going to influence, perhaps, it's going to have a trickle-down effect to the community that they police. If they hate their job, they're probably not going to be, the most optimistic police officer out in the streets. If they love their job, better chance that they are going to have better relations with the community. So all of these things Warden found helped to identify reasons why, or were reasons why, police officers differed from one another. And so if we know these, and if we examine them and try to figure out if we have officers, for instance, and maybe are exhibiting some bad behavior, we can basically do an analysis based on these 5 axes and really identify where do we need to change things. Maybe it's that person's view of human nature that's making them a bad cop, or maybe they have a real legitimate beef. Maybe they don't get along with management because management is really bad. Maybe we have incompetent people in charge of the police department. And so maybe it's the individual officer, maybe it's the environment in which they're policing. But Warden's axes help us to take a closer look and focus in on key points that affect the police officer behavior.